Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. Sigma released their 24 to 70mm f2.8 DN art lens at the beginning of 2020, and it has certainly been a success. But both Tamron with their 28 to 75mm f2.8 G2 and Sony with their 24 to 70mm f2.8 G Master Mark II have since released second generation lenses that brought new optical, feature, and autofocus upgrades to their respective lenses. Sigma has worked to keep their 24 to 70mm competitive by bringing out a new Mark II version of the zoom with new features, less weight, faster autofocus, and a few optical improvements. It remains in that sweet spot of price versus performance. But is the new Sigma 24 to 70mm f2.8 Mark II the standard zoom to buy? Well, find out today in my review.
Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
Out of curiosity, I asked Sigma if I could have one of the first generation lenses to borrow to compare to this new Mark II version. And so I could really get a sense of what has changed with them side by side. It's allowed me to do some more direct comparisons, which I appreciate. So there are a number of actual new features that are included on this new design. There is now an aperture ring, which didn't exist in the Mark I lens. There's an additional custom or function button that is on the top of the lens to allow you to have access to one even when shooting in a vertical position. There is the ability to declick the aperture now, which is very handy, obviously, for video work. There's an aperture iris lock that gives you, again, a little bit more control over how that aperture ring is going to function. You can either lock into it if you prefer to do manual adjustments, or you can lock out of it if you don't really like having an aperture ring. There is a redesign to the way that these switches are handled, whereas before there was a raised bank of switches that adds maybe unnecessary bulk to the lens. They've streamlined that by now having flush-mounted, actual in the lens barrel itself, the switches and buttons, as opposed to being in a raised bank. Now, the visual differences are a little bit subtle at first, and you can see from different perspectives that the lens overall, if you first look at it, they look very, very similar in size. And part of that is because they still taper to the same large diameter up at front. It's 87.8 millimeters in diameter with a quite large 82 millimeter front filter thread. So that aspect hasn't changed. But what has changed is the actual width of the barrel itself. And as mentioned, there is the removal of the bulk of the raised bank, but also they've just made the actual diameter of the majority of the lens a little bit slimmer. And it's also just a little bit shorter, though, in my test, comparing them side by side, we're talking about a millimeter. So it's not a significant difference in overall length, but it all adds up to some definite weight savings. And that's where the most noticeable improvement here is. The weight has dropped from 835 grams down to 735 grams. So it's gone on a diet of 100 grams. That's about 26 ounces in total weight here. Now, unfortunately, with the second generation of the Tamron, which admittedly has a different kind of zoom ratio, 28 to 75 millimeters is not the same to design for as 24 to 70 millimeters, because that 4 millimeters on the wide end is the real challenge there. So it was always lighter and smaller than what the Sigma was, but Sony has done a better job with their G Master Mark II lens of really reducing the size and the weight. And so it now actually is lighter than what the Sigma lens is, even though the Sigma has been reduced in its overall weight. I really appreciate how well they have integrated their new aperture ring here. The way that they've added it, it's not something that adds bulk or size to the lens, but really it just fits into a natural taper on the lens, and it functions really, really well. There are the clearly defined clicks if you're in the click mode at the 1/3 stop points. You can again lock into the A or automatic position if you so desire, and then if you declick that, you can smoothly rack through all of the aperture possibilities, which does give you extra flexibility for video recording. And so again, I really appreciate that well-integrated change there. I will also note that even though the ratio of the rings has changed with the addition of a third ring, I think that Sigma's done a great job from different aspects of balancing the lens design. I think it's a little bit more of a comprehensive design than the older lens. Again, it's subtle, but you can really notice it with them side by side. And so what has happened is that both the zoom and the manual focus rings have become necessarily slimmer to accommodate a third ring on the lens design. But even though it's smaller in its diameter, I do think that this manual focus ring is better integrated. It has a better damping to it, and so it has a lot more feel. On the first lens, it was really light, not a lot of feel there, whereas this new lens has a better damped feeling, and so it makes for a better true manual focus experience. So I also appreciate that. Now inside, again, not necessarily visible from the outside, but if you take a look inside, there has been an increase of the aperture blades from 9 to 11. So that has a dual purpose. It, number one, allows for a more circular aperture iris when the lens is stopped down, always appreciated. But I also actually really like the look of the 22-pointed sun stars that come off of that, as opposed to the 18-pointed sun stars that the earlier lens had. And so, again, well implemented there. They've made a few tweaks that allow the lens to focus even closer than what it could before. Now, as before, we have two different minimum focus distances, one on the wide end, one on the telephoto end. So on the wide end, you can get now as close as 17 centimeters as opposed to 18 centimeters before. Now, because this is a fairly large lens, it means that that actually falls inside the lens hood. And as you can see from this shot, to get my test shot, I had to basically be right on top of the chart. So with something that's flat like that, it's very difficult to get adequate light to the subject. So not a great application there. Maybe a little bit easier in some kind of outdoor or three-dimensional objects where you can get close to a certain point. Though note that you really will emphasize things like, field curvature and overall distortion when you're really, really close to a subject like that. However, if you can get in the right conditions, you can get as high as 0.37 times magnification. Again, I don't think that that's as useful as an actual macro lens that has a decent working distance, but it's nice to have that option, and it means for video, for shooting on the wide end, basically, if you got the lens hood on, you can focus right up until you're bumping the lens hood onto something. So that in itself is going to be useful. On the telephoto end, the minimum focus distance has also been reduced from, I believe, 38 centimeters down to 34 centimeters. So that increases the magnification there from 0.22 times to 0.25 times. And so again, more useful. And with this, there's a little bit better working distance. And so though that magnification level is lower, practically it's a little bit easier to get shots like that out in the real world. And so again, a nice improvement there. Now, some of you complained about this first generation lens when it came to pumping dust inside of it. And so I do know that we have a thorough weather sealing here, hopefully improved in that point. I'm sure that Sigma has received that feedback. I don't shoot in a particularly dusty environment, so I don't always see what you may see in a more dusty environment. And so, I mean, the proof is going to be in the pudding, obviously, as to whether or not the improvements to the weather sealing have helped with this. But certainly it is something I know that Sigma is continually working on to improve. In sum total here, we have a lens that is a little bit shorter, it is slimmer, it is lighter, but it's added a number of new features to it. So that obviously is a core improvement. This is a very professional grade zoom lens that has all the features that Sony's top tier G Master lens does, though price point here is $1,200 US as opposed to $2,300 US for the Sony. So you're getting a lot of bang for your buck here, and that is certainly very, very welcome. Another key area of improvement is with the autofocus. In the last basically year and a half, Sigma has developed an all-new autofocus system, which they call HLA, which stands for high-speed linear actuator. And so rather than an STM-based focus motor, this is more of a linear style motor that they say in the proper conditions can get up to 3 times more thrust or maximum drive speed compared to the focus motor in the older lens. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to get 3 times faster autofocus. It just means that there is more capability there that you're really probably going to notice less in just the short focus pulls, which I didn't have any problem with the older lens. It still does just fine in my tests for that. But what you will see is near instantaneous autofocus, even in more demanding situations. And so that was certainly well appreciated. And you can see indoors and outdoors from my tests that autofocus is just snapping back and forth. And by the way, it is so quiet that even if I put my ear right up to the lens barrel, I hear next to nothing happening inside during autofocus. So great marks on the smoothness and the quietness of this focus motor. I also found a definite improvement when it came to the focus consistency when tracking some action. And in this extended burst of Nala here, as I went through each one of these frames, I found that every one of them was accurately focused. And so that certainly is an area of improvement there. Now on the burst front, I do have to raise the issue that's always there on Sony. It's not on L mount, but on E mount. You're going to face the reality. For example, I've got this currently mounted on the Alpha 1. The Alpha 1 is capable of 30 frames per second, but with third-party lenses, Sony limits that to 15 frames per second. Now, if you're shooting a body that is 15 frames per second or slower, who cares? But if you happen to own one of the sports models, you're going to have this artificial limitation with the Sigma lens that you wouldn't have with the equivalent Sony lens. And so if you're someone who is a sports photographer, you shoot action and doing fast burst as a part of your photography style, you may want to invest in the Sony lens, even though you have to spend a lot more for that simple reason, which is the whole reason why Sony does that. Unfortunate for Sigma, but a reality that we do need to mention. On the video side of things, I was very pleased with what I saw from this lens. I found that autofocus for my focused pulls was very smooth, very confident, no issues at all with it. There's a minimal amount of focus breathing, which is, again, very welcome. I also found that when doing my hand test, good transitions from hand to the eye and vice versa. And then when out shooting real world video shots, the damping in the focus pulls is good. It's not abrupt. And again, minimal focus breathing helps with that. It makes everything seem a little bit more cinematic. I also found I haven't been revealing that I've been filming with it, but I have shot a number of my YouTube episodes over the past 3 weeks with this lens, and I had 0 issues with focus confidence staying locked on my face, which is very important for shooting episodes like this. So autofocus gets great marks from me here. The only reason I would consider the Sony instead is if you happen to be one of those sports shooters that needs maximum focus speed and, more importantly, maximum burst rate with your camera. Finally, let's get to the optical side of things. Now, I will do the deep dive optical breakdown and also a comparison, not only to the older Sony, or older Sigma lens, I should say, but also a little bit to the GM and the Tamron G2 lenses, just to give you a little bit of perspective on that performance. What I found as I begin to dive into this is that we really don't have a new optical formula here. It's the exact same optical breakdown. The elements are in the same position. What I would consider this more of an optimization of an existing optical formula. Optimizing largely because Sigma is now capable of developing thinner aspherical elements than what we saw on this older lens. And those do have some advantages that will show up. And so as a result, we've got minor tweaks and minor improvements to the optical performance. Fortunately, this was already a very good lens optically before, and so I didn't see a lot of huge differences, to be frank, with the 2 lenses side by side. I will try to detail those in the optical breakdown, but I'm just going to give you an overview of what you're going to actually get optically from this new lens. I did find a little bit of longitudinal chromatic aberration. I expected that actually to be a little bit better than what it was. It's not bad, but there is some still there. There is no lateral chromatic aberration, however, and so that's not going to be an issue for your landscape style shots. Unfortunately, I saw the exact same vignette and distortion patterns that I saw on the previous lens. And so that's an area that frankly could have used some improvement, at least on the 24mm wide angle end. I found that there's still a distortion that is quite complex. It required a fair bit of correction if I tried to manually correct it, a plus 24, but I'm not at all satisfied with what I could get in a manual correction. Obviously, there is going to be in-camera profiles for JPEGs, and there will be a profile available in editing software, but it certainly is the amount and the type of distortion, nonlinear distortion, means it's not easily to correct manually. And so it definitely has both more distortion than competing lenses, either the Sony or the Tamron, and I would say the distortion is more complex. It also has a considerable amount of vignette at 24 millimeters. I needed a plus 76 to correct for it, which is about 3 stops of correction needed in the corners. So again, a significant amount there. That distortion changes to a pincushion style distortion later on. It's much more linear, it's easier to fix. Vignette also reduces as you go throughout the zoom range. So it's really only an issue at 24 millimeters, but just note that it is there. And so there's always, there's some minor prices to pay when you have to correct a significant amount of distortion. And so that does affect corner performance a bit on the lens. Now, what I found when looking at the 24 millimeter end optically, as far as sharpness and contrast, is that it is very, very good in the center of the frame. It is good in the mid frame, and it is very, very slightly better in the corners than what the older lens was. Again, nothing significant here, and both the Tamron and the GM Mark II are a little bit better in the corners, though this lens is just as good as either of those lenses in either the center or the mid frame. Peak sharpness across the frame arrives at F8, where you're going to get the most consistent results from corner to corner. And then after a F11, you're going to see some reduced results due to diffraction. And so on this 61 megapixel camera, my A7R5, which I did the test on, I found that F16 was softer and F22 much softer looking still. And so you're going to probably want to keep it at F11 and brighter than that if you want to get the optimal results out of the lens. I did find in some situations where I was out shooting landscape in fairly bright conditions that I could definitely tell that Sigma's optical glass was better than a less expensive lens from another brand that I was shooting at the same time. I had a prime lens along that is less expensive, and the optical glass, superior optical glass of the Sigma definitely showed in those situations, and I definitely preferred the images out of the Sigma in more challenging conditions. Now moving on to 35 millimeters, I saw a little bit better performance, just a little bit better everywhere pretty much. At 50 millimeters, the center is a little bit worse, and the mid frame and the corners may be marginally better, but just a little bit of a different optical profile there. And then at 70 millimeters, what I did note is unfortunately the copy I'm reviewing I think is a little bit decentered. I got stronger looking results on the left side of the frame than what I did on the right side of the frame. And so if I was looking on the left side of the frame, it looks better than the older lens. If I looked at the right side of the frame, this lens looked better. I repeated my test 3 times, setting everything up again just to make sure it wasn't a tilting issue. So unfortunately, I do think there's just a little tiny bit of a decentering issue. Truth of the matter though is when I looked at real world shots where I'm not looking at 200% magnification, everything looked great. Real world sharpness, even on a 61 megapixel body, is very, very good. And on top of that, I found that bokeh looks really good from this lens. It's quite soft and pleasing for a zoom lens, and so that's definitely a strength. I also found flare resistance was very strong from the lens. I basically could not induce any kind of flare artifacts, and so that's fantastic there. It did work very nicely for portraits. Again, it's got great autofocus now, and that combination of good sharpness and very soft bokeh is going to be very pleasing for those of you that are either shooting portraits or weddings and like using a standard zoom for doing that. So optically, this lens is very good. Again, it's not significantly improved over the previous generation lens, but it was already very good and it's gotten just a little bit better. I would say that in summation, that kind of brings together what my view of this lens is. It's more of an evolution of what was already a good lens. I certainly appreciate the added features, the improved autofocus, the bit of weight loss that is there is certainly very welcome to help keep Sigma more competitive with what's happening on the market right now. The image quality improvements were a little bit more minimally than what I expected, but I understood it more when I did a little bit of a deeper dive and found that it was more of an optical optimization as opposed to a new optical design. Fortunately, the previous lens was already very good, and so you are getting a lens that is still very competitive with the lenses that are available on the market. I would say that if you are looking for that solid sweet spot of a mid-tier priced lens, $1,200 US here, that goes all the way to 24 millimeters and kind of does all the things, this is still a very, very solid buy. And so if you're on the market right now, this I think really is going to hit a nice middle ground. Tamron's 28-75 millimeter G2 lens is fantastic, but 28 millimeters is not 24 millimeters. So it's not going to work for everyone, and that extra 4 millimeters may be the difference in needing to buy an additional lens to cover, the wide angle of things. So I understand the attraction here. Sony's GM Mark II lens is still the top of the heap lens. It's a little bit better, in most areas, a little bit lighter, but it's also $1,100 US more expensive. And so I think for many people, they're not going to see enough of a difference between these two lenses to opt for the Sony instead of the Sigma. So that leaves us in a very, very good position. And finally, I would say that if you already own this first generation lens, I would only do the upgrade if you need the new features here, or if you're dissatisfied for some reason with the autofocus performance. This is already a good lens, and while it is better in the Mark II, by the time you sell your old lens and pay for the upgrade, it may not be worth it for you. But of course, your mileage may vary and you can do whatever you want. It's your money. If you want more information, you can check out my written review that is linked to in the description down below. There's also an image gallery linked to there, along with buying links as well. Now, if you want also a deeper dive into the optical performance, jump in with me right now. We'll take a look at that together.
All right, well, we'll start with a comparison looking at vignette and distortion between the new lens, which is going to be here on the left. You'll see the DN2 will always be on the left, and other lenses I'm going to put on the right. So as far as the actual distortion pattern at 24 millimeters, you can see it's just basically the exact same. It's a barrel distortion with a significant amount, but it's not linear. There's a middle bulge, and then it kind of squeezes out on the edges. So with either lens, you can't really manually correct it very well, because if you correct the center lines, as I've done here, you start getting the bulges out of like a pincushion distortion out on the edges. Same thing that I saw back on the older version. So as far as vignette and distortion goes, these lenses are virtually identical. Now, if we compare to a lens like the Tamron 28 to 75 millimeter, of course, Tamron just at 28 millimeters, you can see there's a lot less distortion, and it's a much more linear, easy to correct pattern. Now, that's not really an apples to apples comparison, because the Tamron is 28 millimeters, which is much easier to engineer. But if we look at the G Master, we can see that the G Master at 24 millimeters has much, much less distortion. And again, it's got a little bit of that same kind of mustache pattern, but not nearly as pronounced, much easier to correct for. Now, throughout the rest of the zoom range, we go to a pincushion style distortion and much less distortion and much less vignette, and you can see even manually correcting, very easy to do, no problem at all with that. It's basically only at 24 millimeters you have an issue. Now, if you utilize the standard correction profile, it really isn't that big of an issue. You can see here, this is a shot with a lot of straight lines, and you're not really seeing any kind of bending or distortion pattern there. It looks just fine. Now, when it comes to the fringing, I was a little bit surprised by how much fringing still remains in this. You can see not a lot before the plane of focus, but definitely some of this kind of blue-green type fringing. And if we take a look in some of these real-world shots, I'll just highlight one here. I was just kind of surprised to see this here, because usually Sigma is really, really good at correcting aberrations like this, and some of them remain. Now, I think it may have a potential positive benefit that I'll get to in just a moment. So let's dive into the resolution portion together. Now, I actually went back and did a few tests here on the Alpha 1 as well as the A7R5 Alpha 1 at 50 megapixels, because I had tested the GM on the Alpha 1, and so I wanted an apples to apples comparison. So if we look in the center of the frame here, we can see that looking at the two lenses, I would say that the Sigma is probably a hair better in the center of the frame, although in this zone I would say there's a little bit more contrast and detail for the G Master lens. Now, in the middle of the frame, it's pretty obvious that the G Master has the advantage, and looking down into the corner, the G Master definitely has the advantage there. Looking over on this side, I would say mostly equal, maybe just a little bit more contrast for the G Master, and then over on this side, we can see that, again, the G Master is definitely the winner. Now, to compare with the Tamron G2 lens at 28 millimeters, you can see that in the middle of the frame, it looks really, really good. Two lenses are roughly equal in terms of performance. If we look in the mid frame, the G2 has just a little bit more punch than what the Sigma does, and down here in the corners, the G2 is actually probably the strongest in terms of the corner performance. If we look over on this side, again, it's looking really, really strong there. And over here, it's this area where I would say the Sigma actually looks just a little bit better than what the Tamron does. So obviously some give and take. So we'll now switch over to the Sony a7R Mark V, and I'll do a little bit of a comparison with the older 24 to 70 millimeter Sigma lens. Again, this is 200% magnification, so 61 megapixels. I mean, this on full frame is about as much of a torture test as I can give a lens. I would say in the middle of the frame, though the new version is supposed to be a little bit better, on the two copies I tested, I would actually give the edge to the older lens, which looks really fantastic. In the mid frame, it's mostly a wash to me. I don't really see one better than the other. Now down here in the corner, neither of them look fantastic, as you can see. But if you look at the lines and the building here, they're definitely more distinct than what were the older lens. And so on the older lens, it's a little bit more mushy, and so an improvement there. Switching over to the left side of the frame, side by side, I would say that the older lens has a little bit of an edge there. Coming over to this point, and you know, I'm hard-pressed to really call a winner. Neither looks fantastic. But again, the lines just look a little bit better for me with the new lens. Now, if we stop down to f4, we can see that there is a bump in contrast in the middle of the frame. Definitely a little bit more pop there, looking at some of the writing. In the mid frame here, you can also see a bit of an improvement there. Just the textures are popping a little bit more. Popping over to the left side, we can see that, you know, it's definitely it's a mild improvement, but a definite improvement there. Corners starting to look better, like here, for example, at f5.6, but as you get towards the very edge, it's not till f8 that we see a real improvement. And so for the chart test, I would say that the corners at 24 millimeters never really impressed me that much. Now, on a high-resolution body like this, by f11, diffraction softens the image just a little bit, but it's still perfectly fine. By f22, which is the minimum aperture, though, diffraction has really softened the image and robbed it of contrast. If we go back to this image for a moment, however, this is f5.6. You can see the detail looks amazing in the middle of the frame. It also looks fine here towards the edge of the frame as well, even in the corners. And so overall, I don't really have a lot of concern. I mean, there's still some nice detail there, you know, where it's within the depth of field, right off to the very edge of the frame. Now, if I compare 24 millimeters with 35 millimeters here, we can see that in the middle of the frame, it's about a draw with maybe just a tiny bit more contrast at 35 millimeters compared to 24 millimeters. Mid-frame, also more similar than different, and a very mild improvement in the corner performance, though not by much. Looking over at this side, you can see it's a little bit more pronounced there, that 35 millimeters looks just a little bit better. So I would say that the higher performance reaches out to the mid-frame mostly and is only a little bit more in the corners. Now, 50 millimeters is interesting because it's not as sharp in the center of the frame. It's still good, but not as, you know, just bitingly sharp as it is here. But if we look towards the mid frame, for example, you can see that 50 millimeters is actually better still. I would say it's stronger in the mid frame than what it is in the center of the frame. And if you look towards the corners here, it's actually a little bit better at 50 millimeters than it is at 35 millimeters. Really the strongest wide open performance we've seen in the corners. So just a slightly different sharpness profile. Finally, going to 70 millimeters, you can see that the center performance is just, it's very similar. I would say there's just a little bit more contrast at 70 millimeters. If we look in the mid frame where this was really, really excellent, we can see it similarly excellent, if not a hair better at 70 millimeters. So if you're shooting in the rule of thirds, you're going to get really, really good results. And you can see that corner performance definitely better. Though what you can see here is if I look at the left side, it looks great. If I pan over to the right side here, it isn't as sharp, and that's particularly true as we go on down to the corners. You can see that the right side just doesn't look fantastic, whereas here on the left side, it's quite sharp even towards the edge of the frame. And so that is definitely, and if I compare the upper left corner, definitely looks better than what the lower right corner. So there is a slight centering issue. I redid this test 3 different times. I got the exact same results. Now, at 70 millimeters, truth of the matter is that I was actually really impressed with a lot of my real-world results. Here you can see, even at a pixel level, 61 megapixels. There's tons of resolution there, so I think that most people are going to be happy with real-world shots. I mean, you can even see this little hair that is being shed in the air as it floats away. Pretty impressive stuff. Now, as noted, you can get really, really close, so close that it is hard to get sufficient light on your subject. This close, you're going to lose a little bit of contrast and detail, but you've got a great deal of magnification there. At 70 millimeters, it's a little bit easier to get, though you can still see that it's really not a very flat plane of focus. There's some definite field curvature, though I do think that contrast close-up is a little bit better outside of a little bit of fringing that we see there. I was actually quite impressed with the bokeh quality, and I noted before there's a little bit more fringing than what I like here, but often where that pays off is that it makes for softer bokeh, and I think that that is the case here. You can see that the defocused area is actually really nice and soft for a zoom lens, leaving me just impressed with the look of a lot of shots here. Pretty soft and creamy for a lens like this. That definitely helps when shooting portraits. You can see that we've got good detail on the subject. I mean, I don't think anybody would ever be unhappy with that on 61 megapixels. But you can see that the focus fall off is really quite nice here. And so I was happy with that. Going a little bit wider. And again, you can see really, really nice detail there. No problems with that. And the quality of the blur looks nice. Finally, talking about flare, you can see here that wide open, that at 24 millimeters, there's just no ghosting artifacts that I can see. When I stop down, there's a little tiny rainbow there, and down here, but you really wouldn't even notice that. If I put it off in the edge, again, there's a couple of tiny little ghosting artifacts, but almost nothing to look at. Contrast obviously still looks fantastic. And here at 70 millimeters, again, this is, stop down. I don't see any issue there. No artifacts there. Putting it up in the corner at 70 millimeters, no problem. A very, very impressive flare resistance performance.
So hopefully a deeper look at the optical performance has helped you to make a more informed decision as to whether or not this new Sigma 24 to 70 millimeter Mark II lens is for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.